Webinar now.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session on People Management, Knowledge, Communication and Employment Foundations. We thank you for joining us in what's probably your lunch hour for this valuable session, and we hope you take away some practical learnings to support you, your practice and your staff. My name is Julie Allardyce, and I'm a facilitator in the General Practice team here at MFIN. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands I am working on today. I'm fortunate enough to live by the beautiful Yarra River amongst towering gum trees and thank the traditional owners for their care of the land and waterways over many thousand years. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their cultural, environmental and spiritual connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Before we begin, just to let you know you're all on mute. George has a lot of great information to share, but he's happy for you to submit questions through the Q&A function, and you can do this anonymously if you like. Today's webinar is being recorded and all attendees who have registered will be sent a link with a copy of the recording. At the end of today's session, you'll also receive a short survey. We would be grateful if you could please take a couple of minutes to answer these questions, as it provides us with important feedback on our education sessions and an opportunity for you to inform us of any future topics that you would like us to provide. I would like to welcome George Sotiros today, and we are very grateful to have him present for us today. George is the Director of Health Industry Employment Services and has over 10 years experience in the health industry and a passion for assisting practices, staff and building great employment foundations. George always provides relatable, accurate advice to help support and manage all employment matters. So again, welcome George, and thank you for what I know will be a great session today. Thanks, George.
Thank you, Julie. It's always a little bit hard when it's a bit of a formal introduction. And everyone, obviously, to start off, thank you all for logging on. I was saying to Julie earlier, look, there's a public holiday next week. It's a long weekend, or a super long weekend for everyone in Melbourne. So appreciate everyone's going to be a little bit, stressed and pressured with what's happening. So we've planned this topic for a while now to talk about people management. It is the biggest thing we deal with and manage. So from that side of it, I've got the next, hour and a half of your time to take you through some great tips, some great points and suggestions as to how we can better manage our people. So what I want to step through, though, we've got a few interesting learning outcomes. So as Julie mentioned, please feel free to ask questions throughout it. I've just had a look at the attendees coming in, and there's some very familiar names and faces. So hello to everyone that we know and support. And to everyone new, I hope you enjoy this session. So when I was putting the content together, my objective here is to try and make it as relatable as possible. We were discussing with the PHN about, covering off a little bit on recruitment and retention too, just seeing as it is a big point and issue that we're all struggling with. It is getting better is all I can say. And the recruitment and retention market, I feel maybe if it's that financial pressure or maybe staff that have been jumping around a lot, finally realizing that, it is probably not as green as it is on the other side. So I'm going to go and give you some really good, sharp tips on what to consider when recruiting and retaining staff. I don't think I've spent as much time as I have opposed to the last 3 to 4 years since COVID hit on looking at retention ways, retention policies and retention strategies in practice. So I'm going to take you through some really good tips there. Then we're going to progress through and discuss all things culture. I think it is such an important factor that once we have great culture, it's amazing. Your life, you don't realize what you have when you have great culture. So I'm going to put a few ideas and concepts as to how do we manage culture in practice. But not only that, what happens when we're dealing with bad culture? So I'm going to step you through some of the ideas and processes. And this all then stems in really nicely into understanding claims we deal with. The reason why I suppose there's individuals like myself and HIS around is to manage the risk of claims. Because if it was just as easy as, getting rid of that staff member that's difficult or not being a team player or not fitting as part of your culture, people like myself wouldn't be around. So what we want to step you through today is, well, what is an unfair dismissal? What are the claims we deal with? And especially when you're trying to create a culture that's aligned with your business values and goals, if you have to make that difficult decision, what's stopping you from potentially, issuing warnings or terminating a staff member along those ways? So obviously everything comes back to our lovely employment foundations and systems. And that's what we'll step you through as to, well, what processes, documents, and other systems do you have? So I found two really good cases that I will step everyone through as well, that link back to health industry claims that have gone through to Fair Work. And just to show you how a process is handled, what commissioners consider. And in the end of the day, it's very likely that we're all going to be faced with a claim at some point. So don't be afraid. We've all got professional indemnity insurances and practice indemnity insurances that we can get legal support on. But what you do leading up to a lot of these claims is effectively, what you use to defend a claim that might come through from the commission. So the whole overview today is to look at the recruitment retention journey all the way through to what happens worst case. So let's start off. Obviously, we've presented a lot over the last couple months and trying to share as many, accurate points as we possibly can. Recruitment and retention has always been at the top. So I've sort of made it my job to try and deliver something different every time when it comes to the recruitment and retention. And these are things that we pick up from our members, we pick up from, the trends in the industry and market. But recruitment and retention has been extremely difficult. And I also feel that it's a big factor of our time as managers, our time of, allocating that to be able to be hungry to recruit. So I've broken down a few really good tips and I want to step everyone. And these are my tips. We're not recruitment experts. I feel like it's really hard in that field. But one of the strongest points and a lot of recruitments that we're seeing at the moment, linking back to these first 2 points is having a strong network. And that means yourself building that network and surrounding yourself with people that present opportunities. So if it is like the likes of, the primary health networks, other organizations, individuals like us, we get asked multiple times a day, George, do you know any staff? And sometimes we do. We know staff that move to different areas, different places. And I feel that having a strong network that you can put feelers out to is so important. And we've seen this as well with workplaces that have developed strong relationships with colleges or universities or other areas, and they've been snatching great grads. That's been a massive trend in recruitment, but a lot of these managers and owners have spent a lot of time in fostering those relationships. So think about your referral funnels and think about your network and how you can better build that network channel, because it makes a massive difference. And especially if you build that trust and confidence, as soon as someone plants the idea that, I've worked with George for 5 years, it's a great workplace. They do all the right things. That encouragement from that person who's referring someone to you, that's going to stick a lot more than, putting a job ad up on Seek, someone going through a process, comparing you to 5 or 6 different other places. So it's that reinforcement that, okay, great. Well, if they're saying they're a good workplace and they offer something different to what everyone else isn't, then you will have that connection. So word of mouth referrals, I've repeated it over and over. Try and build that, because that will be the quickest way to recruit good staff at the present moment. Personal experiences, and even we've been recruiting internally. We're fortunate enough to, over the next 3 weeks, we have 3 new staff starting across both of our businesses, the bookkeeping one and our advisory service. And I found, and what I learned through that journey is you can't delay your processes like we once used to. And that's looking at, if you start a recruitment process or you reach out to your contacts, your networks, you put advertisements up. What we found is that people that were proactively looking for employment were were taking opportunities really quick. So by the time we delayed the meeting for 2 or 3 days later to suit our schedules, when we would then go and send them a meeting request or invite, they were already getting snatched up by the time we even had an interview with people, or at the same time, not making a proposal as quick as what you should, and then them getting alternative considerations to think about. So look, some could say it's blessing in disguise, or some could say just it is what it is. However, I feel that you have to be hungry to recruit, and you have to act as quick as you possibly can, because that point there really does assist with being proactive. The candidate sees it, they see that you want to employ them and that they're right fit. So don't delay your recruitment processes. Act quick, hire quick, and in the end of the day, there's always going to be a degree of risk, but that's why you have probationary periods and other processes. Don't just put bums on seats though, because obviously that has its other risks. The massive trend as well of don't be afraid to hire outside of health. Yet again, massive trends, massive increase in non-health industry specific staff entering into private practice, which a lot of people have actually thoroughly enjoyed, on the basis that you get to teach them the way you want. You can ingrain the processes, systems that you've developed in your practice, rather than having someone come in and having either different processes, ways, methods, or habits that they've picked up from other previous workplaces. So it has its perks and benefits, and also brings a very different level of skill set to your workforce as well, because someone who's willing and able to learn is always going to pick up your systems and processes. So I think finding that fit in personality it outweighs someone with years of experience in health. But this is the hard point, because we get very desperate in the market and we're short-staffed, we want to hire staff. So what we've found as well, practices with good culture have just naturally attracted good staff. And if you think about that concept for a second, it's pretty powerful to think about it, that if you've got good staff, good culture, good people, the word spreads. And especially when you're putting feelers out and you've got and maintain the strong reputation, you're going to, and it's a proven fact, attract more staff than practices that have bad culture, high staff turnover, bad retention issues. So I think from that side of it, having that emphasis on good practice culturally is crucial. So, and that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of today about talking about, well, what is culture? What happens when it goes wrong? What culture do we set as managers and owners? And how does that impact our recruitment and retention? Be competitive with your remuneration. So, and I know we have obviously budgets. Almost every sort of general practice we're dealing with is in the process or has started transitioning from bulk to private billing. We find our specialist practices are generally more competitive by default. But for general practice, I think you have to understand what industry rates are at the moment. We're seeing nurses just demand $40 an hour, without years of experience, which a couple of years ago wouldn't be the case, where they would be receiving those rates. In the end of the day, don't get me wrong when I say that, good nurses are worth every bit of that. And I think it's at the moment it's more of the demand of people without the experience or exposure in our environments, demanding excessively high rates just because they know the pressure and the struggles of recruitment. And 9 times out of 10 practices are just accepting it and paying these higher rates, and then having to spend a lot of time upskilling, training, and starting from scratch. Whereas obviously in the past, a lot of those remuneration pressures weren't there. So having to factor an inflated wage cost as well is something that you should be budgeting. And that also comes back to potentially looking, if you are short staffed, well, my overtime bill is going to go up. So let's start mapping that out, because that also impacts your recruitment and retention processes if you don't financially have the cash flow to support it. But when I talk about remuneration, and if you've heard me say this before, it really comes back to thinking about, well, what are our minimum obligations under the award? And then understanding what the industry rates are. So for example, a level 3 support service employee permanent now, which is, say, your receptionist, is $24.47. So in this current situation of market, we're rarely seeing anyone paying the award rate, or if so, it's only for a very short period of time. So understanding what the industry rates are for receptionists, your day-to-day receptionists, we're definitely seeing in the mid, even in some scenarios, high 20s for those day-to-day positions. We have some practices that pay $30 in early 30s to receptionists as well. But from the market rates, it definitely is in that mid to high 20s per hour is what we're seeing the reception. So I think trying to position what the award rates are at a minimum, as mentioned, a level 3 SSE is $24.47 at the moment. If the industry rate's paying $27-ish an hour, you need to know what your base commitment is, factoring in your super and all your additional payments on top. Where practices are standing out from everyone else is thinking about the perks and packages. So if you're employing new staff, it's a great opportunity, and especially in your recruitment or retention drive as well, is to come up with a package that just stands out. And it might be you offer certain flexibility, days off a fortnight or a 4-week period, earlier start and finish times or staggered start and finish times. And I think a lot of people want flexibility. It is a massive thing, but in the health industry, you can't really offer a lot of flexibility on the basis that you need someone to be patient facing, they need to be in rooms, and they need to have that direct contact. So we're not as fortunate as other industries where we can have work from home arrangements. But this is where we're finding the average of hours over periods of time, if it's having a day off every fortnight or 4-week period, has been really incentive to employees to offer. But then also having things and perks like, as part of our policy, everyone gets, 2 days off a year, just as a do whatever you want. If it's to spend time with the kids, go on an extra holiday, have a super long weekend, whatever it might be, offering additional leaves being a massive perk, offering additional super contributions. And then slowly you start to package up a rate that's just not looked at as an hourly rate anymore. So you are then positioned to say, well, we just don't give you a per hour, remuneration package. You also get these other 3 or 4 things that, we really thought hard about. If it is a professional development allowance, we find that, and even we've got the same struggle, you offer professional development allowances, but a lot of people don't actually take that up as well because, certain individuals who want to grow and have that growth will, but we generally find that PD allowances haven't been too popular in certain scenarios. So, and then the final thing from the recruitment and retention side is know why your staff are leaving. If you've got high retention issues, there's generally going to be a root cause of reason. And whilst we have seen the trend over the last couple of years in staff changing just for wanting change, the market being really competitive with remuneration and just losing staff for money, which is out of your control. If there's a consistent pattern and you have a high turnover of staff, you really need to be understanding, well, why are they leaving? And, if you're in that position, one of the best tips that we offer or generally go through, and I hope everyone is, don't be afraid to put questions in the Q&A as we go through everyone. I think exit interviews are the best form of feedback you get for staff that are resigning. Obviously, I mentioned this before, but not staff that are terminated and you don't want feedback from them because that's not going to be really positive. But staff that are actually leaving your practice and, they might be going quietly. They might, we've seen in practices which have cultural based issues, it's generally not a good sign when multiple staff start sending letters to the owners or to directors or to a board. There's generally an undercurrent there of issues with management. So I suppose when you're considering about exit interviews, the whole purpose of it is to get valuable feedback that really doesn't cost you anything. It provides a clear snapshot because generally when staff are leaving, they're more likely to be more honest and open and transparent about what some of the concerns in the workplaces are. You can better gauge why they've left. So if you have a look on our HIS template that we have, We've got reasons like higher pay, improved work-life balance, conflict with managers, family or personal reasons. So at least if you can gauge a reason why someone's left and what you can do to perform better as an organization or as a manager, um, it's hands down one of the simplest and easiest ways to get on top of retention or recruitment-based issues. And it also then allows you to realign to say, well, if we can make improvements in these areas, I think then showing support or having that direct contact with your owners and business owners there of the practice to say, well, look, these are the biggest concerns that we're dealing with staff that are leaving. We need to make some sort of positive change. If it is, you're not getting the ability to recruit more staff and staff are pressured, at least getting that feedback direct from the staff that are leaving to say, well, we're overworked, we're sick of the abuse, we're this culture isn't right for us. At least it gives you a tool to then realign your recruitment processes, but then make some form of positive change or shifting culture. So if you don't have a good exit interview template, I strongly suggest that you look at having one. And hopefully I'm trying to create as much awareness on exit interviews as I possibly can throughout all my presentations at the moment, because it does make a massive difference having these steps and processes. And my final point that I'll always make on these comments is make sure that whoever is conducting the exit interview is very neutral to the circumstance. And that really does mean you want to have someone who's honest feedback and open feedback will be provided to, rather than if, for example, if it's a 2IC that's the cause of the problem, you're not going to have the 2IC do the exit interviews, because your staff that are being part of that and are leaving because of that individual are just going to say everything's perfect and not give you honest and open feedback. So they're my recruitment and retention tips. As mentioned, we just wanted to start off on that because it is a big point, and I hope I've given you some really good suggestions and points to reconsider when recruiting staff. We're happy to be bounce ideas and points off with practices too, so don't be afraid to reach out. But what I want to look into next, I think is a really crucial point. And I think one thing that's made a massive difference in a lot of workplaces over the last couple of years has been strong culture and having the support of management and owners. And keeping a sort of finger on that pulse as to how people are, feeling, how their capacities are, when we're already stretched and to our limits, is a very, very difficult thing to accomplish. So I don't think there's a wrong or right answer when it comes to managing culture in your practice. I personally feel there are a few really good base principles and concepts we should all be adapting to foster a better workplace and a better culture. And how we do it is different. We all have a very different management style. We all have very different personalities. We work with practices that are just completely by the book. Everything that happens is, you sign a bit of paper, we do training on this date and this date. We have all these systems and processes. And then on the completely other side, we have practices that don't have contracts, don't have policies, that have been running for 30, 40 years and everything runs seamlessly and smooth. So the point here is that culture comes back to sort of how we position it as managers, and also what feeds down from your owners. Obviously, each have their own risk, but what I want everyone to consider is, the key points and tips are: do we define the culture that you want in the workplace? And I feel that it's very easy to say, well, how do you define your culture? It's a series of understanding what your expectations, what you want to see from your team, what you deem acceptable as well in that environment. And I think the hardest and the most important thing we have to regularly do is define this to our team on a regular basis. If it is in your staff meetings, if it is in your forms of communication, I think you have to really emphasize sort of that passion and reason as to why and what we do in our day-to-day jobs. And it really does start with that positive sort of mindset when you're addressing things with your staff. So defining your team culture is crucial, but what is most important is actually what you do in reality. So there's no point talking about all the beautiful expectations and things we want to see as part of our culture, but really what you do in action is really what staff will see more. So I think reiterating it and acting and walking the walk when it comes to your expectation of your team culture is the most important thing you can do. Tools, if yet again, there've been a lot of different reasons and methods to measure how your staff are feeling, and how culture is, how, if they're burnt out, tired, having external issues that might be impacting them at work. So if you've recently heard me present on one of those recent series we did, Chris and I spoke about doing a team temp whereby you can just ask an anonymous survey question to your staff on a scale of 1 to 10. How are you feeling? How you're feeling at the moment, and obviously they can rate. And then obviously if they rate themselves a 6, it then comes back to asking a second question is, well, what could make that 1 point higher? So using simple team temperature tools like that allow you to gauge how your staff are at that present time. It is anonymous, but then also being able to understand what can make the workplace better is a really simple and easy method. So methods like that, I personally don't adopt methods like that in our business or workplace because we do quarterly catch-ups with all staff, and this is just the method that we've adopted and we found works exceptionally well. And with the quarterly catch-ups, it really does allow me to meet with my 8 staff to sit down to say, well, what are we, how are we feeling? How's everything going? That honest 360 feedback. What are some of the roadblocks, barriers? What can we do better? What are you struggling with? Is there any, points that you need to address? And generally it allows for that open and transparent communication where you're devoting 100% of your attention to, and it allows you then to make positive change by understanding how your staff are feeling and what some of the key issues are. But again, there's no point collecting and going through the process of gathering all this information if nothing is done with it. So the actions that come back to how you then implement, and there might be some unreasonable things that you can't do or manage or control. So I think it is coming through to realistically setting, well, we can assist with these areas or we can't with others. So I think using a tool or a method to measure how your staff are feeling on a regular is so important. And with our current market that we're dealing with, how are you going to fit that into your very busy schedule as it is? So having a system that's just simple, easy, and not a big struggle for you to implement, and it's not reliant on others, I think is what you need to look for. So allocating that, if it's that half a day, a quarter, or that half an hour or an hour, every fortnight or month, is really a small chunk of time to commit to create transparency and gather an understanding of how your staff are feeling. So think of a model or a method. Also, don't be afraid to ask your team and just to say, look, we want to increase communication. We want to understand how we're all feeling. We're going to put a bit of a survey monkey out to everyone just to think about ways that we can gauge how everyone is, how our workloads are, and just have very simple touch points on a monthly basis. So maybe using your team and involving them as part of that process to gauge your culture is also a very good idea, because when they're involved and it's their idea, they're more likely to contribute and be part of the processes you implement. So what you do will form part of your culture. So what I've tried to reiterate, and one of the points I want to get across is, with what we do on a day-to-day basis, is support hundreds of practices nationally with day-to-day issues. And one of the big trends we've found over the 3 to 4 years since COVID's hit is effectively we're letting individuals get away with a lot more than what we have in the past. And that's because we might be overworked, we might be stressed, we might have a lot on our plate. The fear of recruitment and other staff leaving has been a big cause. And I think that recruitment pressure has meant that we've let that difficult staff member, run the show. They've set sort of a precedent, they've impacted culture, they've created issues, and obviously have set a precedent that, well, if that person can get away with that, I can as well. So what we do as managers and owners effectively forms part of your culture. So if you allow it to be acceptable that, staff can come in late and it's just is what it is, and everyone starts to do it, then that's what you're allowing to form part of how you manage and what you set as that expectation in your workplace. So this is where, yet again, when we're looking at all the circumstances, issues, or when people call for advice, they say, well, how do we deal with this difficult scenario? We've got a cultural issue around staff not taking lunch breaks. Yet again, these issues might be very obvious and easy to resolve, but it's what you do as a manager to support staff to understand what's expected, to understand why things might not be happening the way you want, and then just giving the right support, but creating a form of accountability so they actually make and follow what you expect. So my big point is that, you have to reflect and think about, well, how do you be honest, sort of accountable for yourself as a manager, committed and sincere when you build culture? Because I was trying to think of particular words that we adapt and use to build culture, and I think that sort of hits the nail on the head. And strong leaders, obviously, you'll always be honest and transparent. You have to be accountable for your actions when you're managing staff, and when you're dealing with things and trying to get that positive shift. You have to be committed to the process. There's no point, and I'll always reiterate this, there is no point starting a process if you're not going to be committed to seeing it through in that sincere and supportive way. So I think about your capacity, think about what's in control before you start trying to shift positive culture or to shift culture to a different point. But we can't talk about the good without the bad, can we? So one of the points, and this is the hardest situation I feel that most practices have to deal with, and especially when you have that workplace environment that's starting to derail and you're losing that control and staff are doing what they want. My first point is that it's not easy. And it definitely does test a lot of our managers and owners. And realistically, at this point, managing bad culture then stems to a lot of stress, bullying, work cover related issues. And then it becomes a pretty vicious sort of cycle to get out of that. And then ultimately, when we see managers and other owners then get caught up or caught in between these complaints, it then obviously has a complete breakdown in trust in the relationship, which then it's like everyone's walking on eggshells when you're trying to deal with it. So I hope I've sort of painted a scenario that, hopefully not a lot of you have had to experience or witness, but the importance here of, understanding how to deal with the spot fires to increase it is really important. One of my first points and second point, that I'll make, except for it being very difficult and it will be, mentally draining and hard to deal with, is that you need support. If it is, I think the support starts off with the owners of the business too, and making sure that you're supported with any decisions and difficult decisions you might make. You might have a staff member that's been there for 20, 30 years who's, the main reason or cause as to why staff might be leaving. So, if you're going to start a difficult process, you need to be supported from the directors and owners and board to then be able to implement the change. But then not only that, having a good support line around you is just as important. If it's advisors like myself, and in the HRS team, you need to have somewhere where you can bounce ideas, you can understand your risk, and you can deal with situations to try and shift that culture back around. One of the big points with dealing with cultural-based issues is knowing where to start. And generally speaking, when we're deconstructing a practice that's struggling or having issues with staff leaving or other problems, it is all trying to address with issues that are in your control. So there's no point dealing with things that happened 10 or 20 years ago that you can't go back and reverse or change. And I think setting that mindset with staff that you have to either hold accountable or make them understand what the concerns are. You have to deal with what's in your control. So if it is someone who's talking inappropriately, talking negatively, trying to impact other staff or create more of a pack mentality, which is generally what we see with cultural-based issues in practices. If there's us versus them, trying to break down these silos is such an important point. But you'll generally find that there's one or two instigators to a lot of these issues. So I think really trying to focus energy on time on the key issues that or key individuals that might be contributing to a lot of your cultural-based issues is so important. and by trying to establish that trust and expectation is the first point. Unless things are so severe that you need to have a very firm disciplinary and a form of, I suppose, a dismissal route course of action, it really then comes back to, if things aren't as bad as what they might see, but you need to just build that trust back up, that's where you need to start holding people accountable for their work and understanding what you as the practice expect from them. I'll put it there as point 5, hold yourself and staff accountable. You're going to be investing a lot of energy. There might be a few sleepless nights there in actually trying to make a positive shift or change in the culture. So you need to understand what your role is, and you need to be able to address and deal with the issues at hand. So I think having a very clear path and setting that clear path for your staff to also understand is just as important. So they're sort of the key top 5 tips. And then if you go through that whole process and you're not getting that positive shift or change, or you're getting that pushback, or people aren't adjusting to sort of what your expectations are, all I can say is start managing the individuals, take the appropriate action, and just face it directly. And this is where, issuing warnings, talking about dismissal, I personally feel that it's extremely difficult to change individuals' personalities. So if you are dealing with strong personality-based issues and there's not that cultural alignment there with the practice anymore, then don't be afraid to address that. And I'm not saying to address their personality, but to address their conduct and behavior. And this is the hardest thing you'll do when tackling these issues. So make sure that you have a clear understanding, work with what's in your control, stick through to your process, and then take the appropriate action. So I'm going to step you through then some of the key processes and systems then that you need to consider as management. And I feel that whilst we always understand what the key basic principles are, we really don't understand the complexities of some of the Fair Work processes. So when I was putting this content together, it really is coming back to understanding, well, why are we so concerned, or why do we have to have such a structured process when managing our staff? And it always comes back to risk of claim and maintaining good relationships. So I'm going to spend sort of the next, 15 or so minutes just understanding what our risks are when you're managing staff. And that's generally, as advisors, what we do. It's about, well, you present us an issue. In the back of our mind, it's understanding, well, what is that risk, and how does it impact your practice if you take this appropriate action or not? So I'm going to start off and just hit the nail straight on the head and talk about unfair dismissals. Unfair dismissals, look, it's very likely that at some point in practice, you're going to be faced with an unfair dismissal claim. It's not the end of the world. Sometimes it's good when you have unfair dismissals because there's an end to it, especially if it is a very difficult process. But an employee who's eligible to make an unfair dismissal claim can be done if they have completed their minimum employment period. So I've got this on the next slide, but if you don't know what a minimum employment period is, that's either otherwise known as your probationary period. It's either 6 months if you have 15 or more employees, or if you are under 15 employees, you have a 12-month minimum employment period. So under the Fair Work Act, your staff can only lodge an unfair dismissal if they are or have completed their minimum employment period. So that's 6 or 12 months. A lot of people say, well, George, it's 3 months, or the contract says 3 months, or 6 months if they've got 12 months. But in the end of the day, the Fair Work Act will override those provisions, and it will either be a 6 or a 12-month minimum employment period. So understand your staff, obviously factoring in true casuals that don't form part of that count. So you want to always understand how many staff are on your books, and that's not contractors, that's employees. And understanding that for your contracts and other documentation. We're always very pro putting on your agreements, it's either 6 or 12 months probation, just so there's full transparency there as well as to how to manage that. So with the other key factor, claims have to be lodged within 21 days of dismissal. So we generally say wait for a week after that as well, because sometimes you can have a delayed dismissal time as well. So making sure that if someone's past 21 days plus a week and you haven't heard anything, it's probably very likely that they haven't lodged a claim. If people do lodge it outside of that period, they can obviously ask for an extension. So if someone had a health concern or an issue, they obviously can appeal to say, look, I needed more time to lodge the application. And employees earning less than the high income threshold. So at the moment, that's 162,000, sorry. If you have an employee who's earning more than that, they are not able to lodge an unfair dismissal. So this process is just really important in that first initial period, because then at least you can take a quicker action. You don't have to provide a reason. However, all the case law, Fair Work, everyone's saying that if you terminate someone in probation or in that 6 or 12-month period, you should be articulating to them that it's either performance or conduct related, because then it avoids any claims as to, well, it was because of my illness, my family, my caring obligation. You can pinpoint it back to saying, no, it was actually about your always attending work late, or you weren't performing the job, you weren't following our procedures. So make sure you always have a performance or conduct related reason when terminating in probation. So one of the whole point it comes back to with unfair dismissals is proving that once you're over that period of time and someone's put a claim in, was the dismissal unfair? And the whole concept that now comes back to, you hear the whole, well, George, is it 3 mornings and you're out anymore? Well, not necessarily, right? That might show a process that you've followed. It does come back to following a process that's not harsh, unjust, or unreasonable. And I'm going to go through a few cases with you shortly that show you what the commissions look at when dealing on the harshness or if something's unreasonable when terminating a staff member. But one of the 5 key points comes back to, did you have a valid reason? So was it poor performance, incapacity, breaches of policy, misconduct? So what was the actual valid reason of termination? And generally speaking, if there's no valid reason or someone wasn't guilty of what they've done, obviously that's the first trigger to say, well, that's harsh. Harsh considers the severity of the decision in comparison to the alleged offence. And it obviously takes into, other consequences of individuals' personality. So what you have to think about there is, yet again, if someone is continually coming in late and someone else does it, and then they get terminated for that, for a multiple reasons of other points, the fact that others have gotten away with something that someone else hasn't is a reason that could consider the harshness of a termination. Is it unjust? Considered were they actually guilty of the alleged offence? And yet again, this is why when you're going through issues, you have to substantiate what's happened. If there are only allegations, you need proof. You need to go through investigation processes to know exactly what happened before just dismissing someone on a alleged allegation or issue. And was it unreasonable? Consider obviously whether the evidence presented by the employer supports the alleged offence. So I've got a better slide in the next slide that will break down some of these points. So reinstatement, some of the outcomes we typically see, is generally financially driven. We see a lot of claims settled between that 4 to 6 week period or 4 to 8 week wages, but unfair dismissals are capped at 6-month wages. So there's a 26-week entitlement is the maximum penalty someone can get for an unfair dismissal. But we rarely see reinstatement. So in the end of the day, knowing that process is really important. The key points of, what's harsh and just and unreasonable, and what the commission considers was a valid reason for the dismissal related to the employee's capacity of conduct. Was the employee notified of the reason and given an opportunity to respond? If the employer didn't allow the employee to have a support person, or be it the discussion of the dismissal, was that unreasonable? So yet again, a lot of people say, well, George, do we have to offer a support person? So under the Act, you can only really get in trouble if you decline someone the opportunity to have a support person. It is best practice under all the Fair Work processes to allow an individual to have a support person, but sometimes that can trigger scenarios to make things a lot worse than what they are. And if you're starting a process and you really want to see that positive change, if you ask someone to bring a support person along to that, it just almost heightens the situation, tenfold, and can obviously aggravate a situation a lot worse than what it is. So you have to have an understanding if someone ever requests for a support person, so long as there's no conflicts of interest with regards to that person being there, majority of the times you have to accommodate and allow reasonable time for them to prepare and have a support person. So just never decline a support person without getting appropriate advice from a professional. The other fourth point is whether the employee had previously warned about their performance was unsatisfactory. And yet again, I find this point really interesting. It says the size of the business, a lack of dedicated human resource management specialists or expertise. And really that comes back to and shows that the commission will consider the advice and internal line of support you have. So if you have a dedicated HR person in your business with that title, the commission is going to look at that, realistically, you should know better. You should know the process, you should know the systems, how things are to be run, and they will put that bigger emphasis on compliant with processes and legislation if you do have dedicated HR professionals working internally in the business. So yet again, different to when, we provide advice over the phone. So just be cautious of these factors. And that's generally speaking what the commission considers. So unfair dismissals are not the end of the world. So it is something that, if you do have, and this is probably a good point for you all to check on, who's your practice indemnity with? And that's your insurance for the practice. If you're solo practitioners, it might fall under your doctor's professional indemnity. But you might want to understand what employment cover you have under those policies. So that means that if you do then have a claim, let's just say you've terminated someone that was a bit risky and a claim is presented to you, you can approach your practice indemnity insurance to then obviously provide legal representation with the claim. So that means you don't have to sit through all draft responses, or you can help with the draft, but they can effectively support you through that whole process. So good tips to know, because when you do get a claim, it is very stressful. It's time consuming. It consumes your energy. So you want to be prepared and know how to handle it when they do present themselves. But if you follow the right systems, hopefully you shouldn't be in that position to deal with them. So the other point I just want to talk about, and I know I positioned it very much about unfair dismissals, general protection claims. Yet again, discrimination-based claims is another risk you have when managing staff. So people management, it is, points that look at it. So discriminatory factors like your race, sex, religion, beliefs, age, association with unions, which we really don't have a lot of, or issues. Obviously, we have a lot of nurses that get union representation when issues go wrong, especially if it's about performance management or other issues. And absences for work for valid reasons such as illnesses, injury, or parental leave. So this is probably one of the most common scenarios, is where you have a high performer who's suffering an injury or illness related issue that might be out of their control, or they may not necessarily be thinking about the impacts to practice. And we've seen a spike in issues around these scenarios where you can't necessarily performance manage the individual because they're a high achiever, but other illness or injury related issues are impacting their ability to do the job. So addressing these points can be extremely difficult and can leave a practice very much well exposed to a general protections claim if you then look at dismissing. So one of the case studies that I'll be going through, I intentionally sort of picked a case that looks at a claim that was related to an illness or injury related issue that put a business in a hard spot, that then led to a termination, which had obviously a claim that led to the employee with a nice payout. So making sure that you do it. The other point is, yet again, complaints regarding their employment. So what that means is that if an employee raises a concern, so if they exercise a workplace right to say, look, I feel like I'm being bullied, by that staff member, they've done this, these are the scenarios. If an individual is then treated less favorably for exercising that right, and you look at terminating or taking disciplinary action against them for doing so, that can also form into a general protections related claim. So general protections claim are very different to unfair dismissal because A, they don't have to be employed in a minimum employment period. So if you discriminate or someone has proof to effectively claim a GP claim, then it can be done at any point, even at the point of interview. So if you're going through an interview process and you say, look, well, your age, you're too young for this position, and we don't think it's suitable. We want someone who's older and more experienced. You're discriminating against their age on that basis. So if you've positioned it really wrong and it's just come out that way, that individual then has the right to say, well, you discriminated against me because of my age. And from that point there, they can put a claim in even at interview. So they don't have to be employed with you to put a general protection claim in. So this is the reason why you have to then make sure you have a structured recruitment process and obviously don't engage in certain discussions, because most of the scenarios we see where it is, borderline is just in error or something was misinterpreted the wrong way, but the intentions weren't to discriminate against someone. So just be very cautious with how you articulate this. So again, you have to make sure that you do a full assessment and avoid general protections claims, because once it's obviously lodged, they're uncapped claims. So depending on the severity of the circumstance and damages and things that have occurred, we've seen them settle in the hundreds of thousands of dollars in a lot of the case law that we see come through. So be mindful and be very cautious of general protections claims. So I mentioned before the minimum employment period. This is just a nice little slide for you just to see. So if it's 6 months for business with 15 or more, or if you're a small business with under 15, it's 12 months. Staff, one thing we often get asked is, George, can we extend the minimum employment periods? The answer is no. You can't recommence or extend someone's probationary period beyond the 6 or 12-month period. It then falls out of that period, and the employee then has the right of claim, even if you've put it in a contract or in writing to say we're extending it. The right under the legislation still stands, and you can still be then subject to an unfair dismissal claim if you extend it. So don't extend probationary periods beyond the legislated amount. So I want to talk about informal versus formal processes. And I think this is a really good point and a great refresher if you are going through and dealing with difficult scenarios. The intent behind this is just to consider, well, how are we performing? How should we be addressing things? And I want to give you the encouragement to really, if you are going to deal with a difficult scenario, just know the differences with the practical processes you need to follow. And even informal processes are really, really productive. And then obviously understanding when to start a formal process is also really good. So an informal process. And anyone, if you've got questions, please don't be afraid to put them through in the Q&A as well. I know this is a very, process and people management driven topic, but don't be afraid to ask any questions or scenarios you might have. So when we discuss informal processes, so this is now where you've gotten to a stage where you have a staff member who might be consistently at a point where there might be errors or issues occurring. It might be behavioral, it might be, performance or not following procedure related. So we love the whole informal process because it really does allow you to take control of all the little spot fires that you deal with. And if you think about your day-to-day process, how many issues, how many other little points or inconsistencies appear, what you do with those systems or processes is so crucial as to how you can shift your culture and hold people accountable. And I feel that the informal discussions you have should really layer your cake when it comes time to starting a formal process. And the more time you invest in your informal processes, the easier it will make your formal processes. So very simple concept, and you've probably all done it. But what we do in practice is yet again really hard, because you don't want to seem as if you're not supporting an individual. And it's not that you don't want to be too harsh in these discussions, but I think you have to set clear expectations and boundaries. And that's why we, when you pull someone aside in your office, or when you re-go through a process, or when something's not being done correctly. And I'll give you a few scenarios or examples. So our biggest point if you have a staff member who's not performing or continually not following a specific practice procedure or process, or they may be, for example, acting in an inappropriate tone towards specific staff, or there might be key issues or conflicts among staff that they're aggravating, having that informal discussion means, pulling the individual aside and having a discussion that allows you to gather as much information as you possibly can. And if it is, look, I've noticed that there've been, a few areas with regards to you making these appointments or, putting these charts with this particular patient, can you step me through the process? I just want to know sort of what's going on and how we can address it and provide support. And you want to allow the employee to reflect as to sort of what that concern is, or if there is a fact that they might be, talking inappropriately or rude to other staff, you may then want to address that to say, look, I've noticed that your tone is out of character, or I've noticed that, there's been a bit of tension between you and this individual. What's going on? And if they're completely oblivious to it, or if there are, points that they're not even aware as to how they're acting, this is exactly the benefit of these informal processes, because you then want to say, this is what we expect, we'll support you in these ways. And, let's regularly catch up to then just see, how things perform. So you can then obviously, and we, even though it's informal, our advice is when you have that consistent error and it's time to address it, you want to send a nice email or a nice, if you use chat features through certain programs, you want to send that follow-up email just to say, George, look, it was great touching base with you. As discussed, the process for bookings or, when dealing with your tone or attitude or whatever it might be, just want you to be, mindful of what we discussed. If you've got relevant processes or systems, refer to them. Otherwise, please let us know. We're here for support. If you've got any questions, please let me know. Sending a nice friendly note or email in that manner instantly documents your whole discussion. It creates that line of accountability. It shows that you're there to legitimately support them. And then you need to just see that through and then still touch base when, if things get better, great, perfect. You want to also reinforce that. Just say, look, I noticed you've made a massive difference. It's good. Let's keep it up. If you need anything, let me know. Or if you think we can do things better, get involved. So once it's in writing, you then have that first foundation to say, well, we're supporting, we're addressing it, and we're embracing a culture that really is then setting what we expect. Because the benefit of that, if it consistently becomes an issue, you can then relay back to that email or that message or note just to show that, look, this has now happened the second or third time again. We've already addressed this with you informally, and then you can consider what your formal processes are. So, and yet again, keep it nice, friendly, and even though it's an informal discussion, it really is just then trying to gather what the root cause of the issue is and then trying to provide a nice solution. So we have had a lovely question come through. So when you have an informal meeting, do you have to offer them a support person? So generally at this stage, my response is no. I feel that if you're just, providing that guidance and support, you want them to fully understand what the concerns are, what the processes are, and just allow that opportunity for response. And if it starts to get a little bit heated or staff aren't necessarily responding back, or if they ask for one, of course, instantly, you can stop whatever discussion you're having to then have a formal support person there. But then I feel that it also changes the whole intent of that discussion. And what we generally find is when someone, becomes a bit agitated or isn't accountable for their actions or behavior and wants to start a formal process by, showing reasons of having support persons there, it generally aggravates situations and matters. So my advice in this scenario is I wouldn't necessarily be offering, you can if you want, but I wouldn't be offering at this point, because it really is just trying to show the support, trying to understand the issue, understand their perspective on things, to then show positive improvement. Because if you tap them on the shoulder and they make the improvement, then it's great. That's what we want. We've met what we expected. We've held them accountable. We've been accountable for doing what we should do as managers. And then from there, you can proceed. So when I talk about the formal processes, that's where 100% we'll be recommending to have support persons present. So thanks for the question. So following through, as mentioned, they're your informal. Just make sure things are very well documented as well. And especially if you are, ever faced with a claim, there's nothing worse than, I wrote it on this note, or it was all verbal. We never documented that. Having a nice documented structure with your informal discussions is really important. And that then allows you to obviously have the right proof evidence to support your claims. So make sure you keep that. If you have a shared drive, make sure you have one for your management, for argument's sake. And then you can document under each staff member's a folder or account, or how you structure it. You can save any notes, emails, or discussions you've had that are either disciplinary related. So make sure you do have those informal notes and discussions well documented. But I want to talk about the formal process, and this then leads up to the build-up of the informal process we discussed. It is then, you've gone through, X amount of processes, or something's happened that's quite significant or of concern that you have to formally investigate, understand, and then have some form of disciplinary outcome. And it does get to certain points, especially when you are performance managing staff, or when staff have significant behavioral or conduct related issues. Sometimes there really is only one option, but to follow a formal process, because all the informal discussions and points don't get taken seriously. So depending on the circumstances, a formal process can just be an absolute game changer and create the awareness and expectation for someone who might not be taking things seriously. So a formal process, you have to understand all the issues that have happened at hand. And I feel that when we have these processes, you need to know the who, what, when, where, why. And I'm going to step you through these points. And obviously the processes of allowing individuals to respond, having support persons, and then applying the disciplinary processes. So step one, you almost become like a little inspector. And I think that comes back to, if an issue is presented to you, it should be your obligation as a manager and as owners to understand exactly what's happened. You need to know who was involved, what the scenario was, and you need to document that process. And it really is that fact-finding point that then allows you to allow the opportunity to respond, to take appropriate action. So one key issue that we generally miss, and I know it's sometimes very hard, but if you do it in the moment, it makes the process a lot easier. So things like taking notes of the dates, times, and relevant information of when things have happened. I know that sounds really obvious, but when you have serious issues that are occurring, and especially for staff who aren't accountable for their actions or lack that insight as to how they're performing, what the issues are, they might be loved by everyone. They might be, loved by all the patients and all of the above, loved by all the doctors. But when they're the reason why your staff are leaving, or when they're being rude or snapping at staff or issues, having the specifics and having the scenarios around what has occurred is really the only key way to shift some of these individuals around to say, well, look, you're great at your job. You're great at what you do. The doctors love you. The patients love you. However, we're having concerns with your tone, your attitude, your conduct, your behavior. And that's effectively what we're here to discuss. And we've got, X amount of issues that have occurred. So that's where you can provide the dates, times, and issues. And you don't want to leave it snowball. There's nothing worse than starting formal processes and getting to a point where you have a massive list that you've collected, say, over 6 months, and you go back to a staff member to say, hey, well, over the last 6 months, we've had these issues on this date, this time, and make a big list. If you're not addressing these issues with the staff then and there, going to them with a list just aggravates issues. So this is where those informal discussions that I mentioned really set that tone to then articulate that expectation, have a live discussion, send them emails. So then when you have to then address the formal process, that's where you can sit down and say, look, we've had 3 situations which we've addressed with you. We've sent you emails or follow-up notes on, on our software programs, to address sort of that expected behavior. There's been another issue, and now we're at that point where, we're going to follow that formal process. So that's where keeping track of those informal discussions should also form part of this formal process. So, but things to consider around performance management and people management is, how serious is the matter? We get storms in teacups all the time where, things are portrayed to be a lot worse than what they actually were. But, when you look at it, it generally, it may not be as bad as what people think. But obviously, if there's things like misconduct and other related issues that impact the reputation of the business, or breach significant policies or processes, that's where ultimately you can consider summary dismissals and looking at instant dismissals. So you have to look at the impact and the severity of what's occurred. How long has the issue existed for? And this can be a really hard matter. And this is where, if you have a long-standing staff member who's been getting away with certain things and impacting culture for long periods of time, it can be really tricky to all of a sudden address it, because it's been accepted for so long. Holding one accountable then is yet again going to be a point that you have to then put out for. So, but if it's someone's first time, it's been the first issue, or is it the third time, that all then comes into how quick you can act. You then need to look at your policies, processes, contracts, records, and the cases that I'm going to provide you through later from Fair Work. Obviously reiterate the importance of having policies, having contracts. And this is where you really need them, is when you have a claim or a dispute when it comes to managing your staff. That's where you need these policies. So, and think about what you've done as an employer. So when you're assessing the process, you might need to take a few steps back before you can move forward. And if you've just been busy, or you haven't had the opportunity to address it or set that foundation, or actually start a process, maybe issuing a warning to that person may not be appropriate if you haven't outlined the expectation. So this is yet again some of the key factors that you should contribute as to how to approach a staff member on certain matters. So yet again, think about what you do. Other points to factor, and yet again, we've had some pretty interesting scenarios come through the office recently. And I think family and domestic violence has been a big one over the last couple of years that have triggered a change in someone's character or personality. They haven't necessarily disclosed with what they've been going through at home, but their attendance has dropped. They haven't been obviously coming to work on time. They've no showing to shifts. Their performance has dropped, and some of these factors that obviously practices after, in hindsight, have realized, well, that was out of character. Also set those little triggers that if you start to see that difference or point in someone's character, well, is that normal for George to act that way or not? So yet again, having that communication and identifying that point can actually really be a key trigger that may impact the process you apply. However, if you go through the process, you allow people the opportunity to respond to why they might be underperforming, what the concerns might be. If someone doesn't choose to disclose a personal or family or other related issue or health related issue, unfortunately, that's not your obligation to force someone to tell you something. So you can set that expectation with the performance and expectation, and for them to adhere to it. And as mentioned, if they don't disclose it, it is something that, it's out of your control. So yet again, if you haven't already addressed the issues, you provide enough time between what happens next and what's expected. So making sure you follow through with the process. We have had another question come through, so thank you for whoever's put that point. So the question is, uneven workloads of nurses seems to be a cause of frustration for fellow nurses. We have a nurse who patients will ask not to be put in with. That then makes the workload greater for other nurses. So not try to deal with this. Really good question. And yet again, this is probably where understanding why the staff member isn't necessarily, I suppose, either performing, or is it because you're generally, understaffed from your nursing points, or why they're not taking on additional work. So I think with the shortages that we're sort of all facing, you need to establish, well, why the workload's even uneven in the first point. Is it because they only like to do a particular part of their whole role? And we've seen that quite a bit recently, where, nurses won't want to do care plans, or they'll just want to do treatment room work, and they'll put all the harder tasks on other nurses. So coming back to then understanding role clarity and trying to understand, well, you have to do this as part of your job. But yet again, that can be a bit of a trap as well, because if you've got a high performing nurse who excels in a particular area, who obviously can do that, obviously not healthy that they're putting off and not being a team player and supporting individuals. But we have had some really good outcomes where employers have managed to identify some of the strengths of their team and then put them in more clearly defined roles to then obviously excel in that workplace, rather than looking at it as a performance management and termination. It's been more of a, well, let's shift the role. And it's not rewarding bad behavior, especially if the approach from the individual is quite ethical, but someone could be doing it unintentionally. So the first thing is just to look at, well, why is it unreasonable? Is there ways that the workflow can be shifted to be even? And sometimes it is just starting off by creating that awareness and knowing what the root cause of the issues are. So my suggestion there would be, start off by understanding with all your nurses sort of what the workflow pattern is. Look at how things should be rostered, look at what tasks might be being delegated, and then understanding, well, is it sort of a deliberate action or behavior, and sitting down to then re-clarify the role. Well, this does form part of your role and we need to see this. So sometimes it can be really tricky. And one of the cases we have is obviously with a nurse and addressing some similar attributes and behaviors. So understand what's happening and then have a solution to address it. And you might want to get your clinical lead involved in this as well, to then have that expectation set from your doctors. And I know they can't supervise nurses, it's not about that, but you can have your clinical lead team set the foundation as process as to how the treatment room needs to operate and run in line with all their scopes, practices, the expectations of the role. And then you might need to start a performance management process if the individual doesn't show improvement. So thanks for putting that through, but definitely there's a lot more factors there, and more than happy to discuss after as well. So in between your steps of, you've investigated, you've looked at the issues, you have to prepare yourself as best as possible. And as mentioned, becoming a subject matter expert on these points is crucial, because you need to be across it so you don't get cornered as a manager. And there's nothing worse than starting a process and having a staff member, I'm not going to say walk all over you, but having a staff member call the shots. It is the most unhealthiest and hardest thing to come out of, especially when you're going into these matters unprepared. So this is where, when you go into a meeting of this sort of level, of a formal meeting, having all the facts, having all the points, and trying to obviously get the individual to understand the concerns and issues you're having should be your number one priority. And that's where you can set that expectation and you can put it back to the areas they're actually coming up with. So you want to obviously let the individual know of a meeting. This is where you can offer them or let them have a support person present, because at this point it is probably a formal meeting, where they obviously should have someone there, because it likely is to result in either a warning or a performance improvement plan. And if you're uncomfortable, or if this is a very strong personality or a difficult person that's been hard to deal with for a long period of time, and you get a bit nervous, or you might not be comfortable in talking off the top of your head, use scripts, use dot points, have relevant facts to keep you stay on track. So there's nothing wrong with having your points scripted to address with an individual. And obviously it might not be you who addresses it, might be the doctor, it might be, an owner, someone who's obviously in that capacity, who really, might have that different relationship with the person as well. So I think prepping yourself as much as possible is a key success to obviously trying to educate that person what the concerns are. So keep the matter private. I think in all your discussions, the last thing you want to do is send someone a notice to say, look, we want to address, some behavioral related issues or performance related concerns with you. And especially for individuals who are really driving that pack mentality, where they will then, once you send that email to them, go to all the other staff to say, oh, George just sent me a nasty email and wants me to catch up with HR and, meet with a doctor to go through performance issues and try to exacerbate and aggravate the issue. And this is a very common thing we actually do see. So I think it's so important that in the communication that you have, obviously you only keep it in discussion with the relevant managers and parties involved. Outline in writing when you send that invitation that, it's not to be addressed with other staff of the practice, and that if you've got any concerns to directly come to myself or the other person that might be with you. So I think outlining that expectation, outlining that it's to be confidential is a crucial point, because it really does stop that cultural based issue. And if it does become addressed and the individual does go around to others and negatively talks about the situation or scenario, that's where you then have the right to instantly issue warnings and allow that opportunity to say, look, well, you brought this up with 3 staff and we clearly told you not to. And allow that opportunity to say, well, why have you breached that direct response we provided? So have the points and have the meetings in a situation where it is, appropriate. There's no good time to ever really do this, but you might want to do it at sort of the start of a shift or at the end of the shift. You might want to do it outside of the workplace. I didn't realize how many workplaces have very difficult or thin walls. So, having a disciplinary discussion or point might be really hard to do in office when you've got other staff walking around, and it never looks good when someone's having a formal meeting with managers and doctors. So make sure you think about the environment as to when you're having the meeting. When you meet with the employee, yet again, at this point, they understand why they're there. You've outlined that in the email or correspondence to them. They might have a support person there, but it's then your obligation to state, well, look, over the last X amount of period, we've been having these concerns, these issues with regards to your performance. And, we've sent you, several emails confirming the points we've addressed. Ultimately, we want to give you an opportunity to respond, because at this point, we're concerned and considering disciplinary action. So allowing that opportunity of response at that meeting and then allows you to obviously confirm what your next course of action can be. And considering someone might turn around to say, well, look, I didn't realize the severity of it, and I'm happy to improve. I didn't realize I offended this person or was acting in this way, or I wasn't aware I was making an error. If individuals come into matters with an open mind and sort of are accountable, legitimately accountable for how they're acting in a workplace, that's generally a really good sign. And if they've got that acknowledgement and their willingness to show that they're willing to improve, you should obviously take that as a positive step to work with the individual. Whereas on the other side of it, and most of the time this is the case, where individuals just aren't accountable, can't see what they've done wrong as being the key issue or concern, obviously aggravates situations where, you're then more in a position to start having more of a warning / termination discussion following it. So allowing that response to hold them accountable is the whole point of this meeting, and not allowing the staff member to distract you from why you're there is such an important point. And this is why you might want to script the point, because if you're talking about their performance, their conduct, and they say, well, George does this over there and he does that, you have to have the ability to bring it back in line to say, look, this has nothing to do with what you've just mentioned. We're here to talk about, your performance or your conduct or your behavior. And these are the scenarios and issues. Whilst I appreciate what you're saying, it's not related to what we're here to discuss. So I think it really is important that you keep it all aligned with the points that you're addressing in that meeting. So it has to be an open discussion. And in the end of the day, you don't want the employee to be telling you what the scenarios and issues and points are. However, there has to be that willingness. Staff might, provide some practical points as to why things have occurred. Others might just sit there in silence. Others might be aggressive. So you need to outline it and consider any points staff raise, And if someone does raise a legitimate point that you haven't factored, you may not want to make a course of action at that meeting. You might want to sort of finish the meeting and get back to them the next day with what the process might be. And obviously outline, the positive attributes too. Because some of these staff that you're going to have discussions with might be high performers, but yet again, they might lack insight as to how they behave and act in the workplace. So I think it's important to keep it balanced, but hold them accountable too. So I think these are my little key tips when we step people through managing issues. Talk about the issue, not the person. It really is, bringing it back to if it's behavioral conduct, or other related issues. Make sure you really hand in on that. Explore the reasons why there's issues. So if that's allowing the having different scenarios or points presented to the employee, you might want to just sort of trigger that train of thought. I've outlined to involve the employee as part of the discussion. They may or may not, it's completely up to that. And then use your foundations and systems around it. So talking about the nurse that's not necessarily, taking on activities or is being uneven with their workload or capacity, this is where you might want to use their position description to outline that expectation of their roles, duties, allow them that opportunity to respond, that they know their role. So clarify the details in what you want to see from them. Yet again, your approach as a manager really does set the tone of these meetings. And especially if you have been supportive and you have gotten to that point where, the employee knows this is coming, it makes your life a lot easier if you've done that groundwork with a lot of those informal processes, because it's not going to be to their surprise. And realistically, any good performance management process an employer follows should really never be a surprise to an employee, because it means that you've done a good job leading up to that meeting. So that's my big point of recommendation is make sure that your tone to it is entered in appropriately and supportive, and you can demonstrate what you've done up until that point. So at this point, you might want to look at if it is just the start of a formal process and you're not going to be issuing a warning. You might want to obviously start a performance improvement plan to then outline the expectations, the clarity, what support you'll offer, but most importantly, the consequences. I think it's really important that we don't shy away from outlining what the risks and issues are, because if the behavior continues, and it's actually part of the fair work process that we went through before, that you actually have to outline the concerns, issues, and potential consequences. So you're obviously, by following this process, adhering to the unfair dismissal, the harsh, unjust, and unreasonable processes. So make sure when you do set in place a performance improvement plan, do it the way you like it. We've got set templates that you can use, but as long as there's a clear expectation on the performance, the support, the clarity, periods of review, and the consequence, I think you position yourself very strongly then when something else occurs. Formal meeting records, we've got some great templates and resources for managing formal meeting records, because you go through all that heartache if you're not going to document it properly. Yet again, it comes back to, if you do have a claim or a dispute, what are you going to use outside of having verbal records of matters? So just have a nice suite of templates that just allow you to act more effectively and efficiently and keep your record keeping in order. So you can use this as just a general, meeting record or a formal meeting record, but documents like this show the process that you've followed. That's not harsh, unjust, or unreasonable. And yet again, the full point there is that you just want to be transparent with what you expect. All the documentation and resources that you put together and present will protect you down track. So once you've gone through and implemented the system and process, it all comes back to monitoring. It's like any quality improvement exercise, isn't it? You go through, you spend all the energy and effort making improvements, saying what's expected, making change, implementing change, and support. But if you're not then going to review what's happened, it's not being committed through to the process. And this is, yet again, we're talking about being accountable back to ourselves as managers. You really do want to provide that feedback to the employee who you've just gone through that process with, and proactively provide the support they need. Even if the issue is resolved, it's good you want to obviously pat them on the back to say, look, it's been great to obviously go through it. Your performance is so much better, or we're happy with sort of your approach or tone. So I think going through and actually providing that positive reinforcement will hopefully keep that support going through. Obviously, if they don't show it, disciplinary action's the way. So if they continue to underperform and they disregard the processes and systems you've implemented, you need to take action. And forming part of our culture, if you just then allow that behavior to continue after you go through that hard yard of starting a process, as I mentioned before, that's then a choice that you may have made or you are making to allow it to become part of your practice. So, and this is hard. You might have all those surrounding factors and issues. However, if you've gone through all this energy and point just to allow someone to continue to get away with what you've tried to address, it defeats the purpose of obviously managing that, and it will continually impact the culture you set. So looking at sort of the key points, make sure you apply the correct form of action to the employee. And this is where we get a lot of practices that might say, George, I want to make this person redundant. I don't want that role anymore. And that's generally an alarm bell for me to say, well, wait a minute, what are you actually talking about? Step me through. What's the redundancy for? Is it a genuine redundancy? Are you losing a doctor? Is it a financial reason? Are you merging the roles? Is it technology? No, I just really don't want them there. They're terrible. They're underperforming. They've been there for ages and I just don't want them there anymore. Obviously, the risk in applying the wrong process to the wrong approach just creates unnecessary risk, because if you're then going to go put someone else in next week in that role, it's not a genuine redundancy. And then it exposes you to unfair dismissal and general protections claims. So when we say apply the correct formal process to the employee, you need to know what you're dealing with. Whilst there might be some scenarios where you could probably get away with doing things like that, our advice is always tackling things head on and using the correct course of action for the matters. So, and yet again, that's where getting the right advice helps. Include all your formal discussions, warnings, and termination. So if you're all the points and discussions you've had along the way, it might include formal warnings, first and final, second warning, third warnings, and obviously all the way up to and including termination. Always documented. Whenever you're at the point of issuing any form of disciplinary action, you need to document it. And it's a crucial point that if you do have a claim back, you need to show what it is. And try to use the term in your discussion, disciplinary action up to and including termination. So I feel like it's a big versatile term that covers a broad arrangement of, termination, warnings, and so forth. So disciplinary action up to and including termination. So I'm going to finish off. I've got two little cases before we end, which I think are really, interesting points and case studies. And they're all within the recent years, which is really good. And the first one we had was involving actually a practice manager in a general practice. So this case started in 2019, and the Fair Work Commission decided that a medical practice was justified for summarily or terminating someone on misconduct, and that being the manager, for patient record breaches and unauthorized changes to her employment contract. So this all started in 2016 when the practice manager started with the practice. The practice manager was required to comply on commencement with all the practice policies and procedures, and undertook, obviously, probably like you all do, the role of HR, including obviously preparation of contracts, templates, and policies. Part of the preparation as well was being obligated to have the privacy policy manual comply with the Privacy Act. So that was part of the role as being the practice manager in this clinic. So in 2019, the practice determined that the manager did not obtain appropriate consent when releasing patient information. It was also alleged that the practice manager had, without authority, in 2017, varied her employment contract to her benefit, and further in 2019, issued and accepted a letter converting her employment from casual to part-time. So obviously, after dismissing the employee in 2019, the medical practice advised the practice manager's lawyer. So the practice manager had engaged a lawyer in this scenario, that the practice manager was going to be dismissed and issued a termination letter without notice. The practice manager then lodged an unfair dismissal claim with the commission. So in terms of releasing patient information, what's interesting in this matter is that the individual didn't seek appropriate consent. So the issue arose when the practice manager received a request, and it's actually a Melbourne-based, this is a Melbourne case as well, requested from a doctor at a Melbourne hospital to provide a copy of a patient's medical history to allow an organ donation upon the death of a patient. So the request was also confirmed via fax. The practice manager provided the medical records in about 90 minutes without consulting any other persons, including the patient's general practitioner. So the GP did not become aware of this until 3 weeks later. So the policy manual that came back requires signed authority of the patient request is made by a person other than the patient. The patient, if they're incapable of providing consent, then it has to be granted on compassionate grounds and upon receipt of an enduring power of attorney. So this is in the practice's policy and procedure, so which the manager had drafted. So the policy manual also required the practice manager to obtain approval from the doctor at the medical practice before releasing such records. So the PM could not adequately explain why she was unable to obtain approval from the patient's general practitioner or why any other doctor on duty couldn't. So the commission concluded that this failure consisted as a substantial breach of the practice policy manual. So yet again, this is why importance of policies is really crucial. So in terms, and if you think about now, we're going to talk about the contracts, and we all draft contracts. You might draft your own contracts. We always avoid not to for this reason. In terms of practice managers' employment conditions, it was discovered in 2017 that the PM had drafted, issued, and signed an employment contract containing a number of improvements on her employment conditions that were more beneficial than her previous employment condition. This was done without the involvement or consent of the medical practice. The practice manager contended this was a draft document. However, the commission did not accept that and explained that given that she had inserted her name, the date, and signature in the acceptance signature of the employment contract, it was also discovered in 2019 that the PM had converted her employment from casual to part-time without authorization. So the PM contended this again and said that it was compliance with the casual conversion under the HPSS award. However, the Fair Work Commission did not accept this reason and ultimately outlined that it's not an automatic right to casual conversion for a full-time or part-time employment. So the commission effectively decided that the medical practice had a valid reason for the dismissal, and the dismissal process was satisfactory, and the practice manager's conduct justified non-payment of notice. So outlining as well that the importance of having your practice procedures, policies, and authorizations of valid employment contracts has to be obtained by the employer. So key takeaways on those 2 points and matters. And I know this is involving a practice manager, but it comes back to you might be positioned to have a lot of pressure when it comes to some of these processes and systems. But this is a great example as to how it goes back around to obviously create risk. So make sure you know how your systems and processes all apply, and obviously don't put yourself in a position of risk if you don't have to, and follow procedures. If you can't obviously follow the procedures, you then need to look at either varying them or altering them to suit your practice setting. So that sort of drags us up to the time. So my sort of top tips that I'll cover off, use the right process to address the right issue. It's so important that we're fair and reasonable in all the processes that we follow. My big tip is, provide a process that you would expect to receive. So if you're performance managing or you've got issues or concerns with staff, if you're in that position, what would you want to see? What would that communication look like? How would you want to be handled? How would you want it to be addressed? And if you think about maintaining that relationship and being as supportive as possible, I think you have to take that approach. Seek advice. some of these matters are extremely difficult and hard. And if you don't handle them correctly from the beginning, they can stem into being bigger than what they have to be. So especially if there's other health or performance or other related issues that make the matter a lot more complex than what it is. So yet again, key point, seek that advice. Don't act in the heat of the moment. Always take that moment, reflect, gather your thoughts, and then cool down. And then obviously, once you're gathered, take the appropriate steps. Start any process that you've been holding off as soon as you're possibly ready. And this is why, as mentioned, in this environment, I feel that practices are letting a lot of staff get away with things that they otherwise wouldn't in different environments. So this is probably the sign to say, hey, you know what, maybe it is time to address that underperformer, that staff that's creating cultural issues, because it's just going to get worse and it's just going to continue to negatively impact your practice and culture. So everyone, thank you. I think that's it from me. So Julie, I'm not sure if you're...
Yep. I'd just like to thank you, George. That was excellent advice. And I'm sure every practice manager on today can relate to all of it, some of it, because managing staff is, as we know, is not easy. But thank you for your time. And again, I'd just like to remind everybody, if you can complete our evaluation, it'll pop up as you exit the Zoom. And I'd like to wish everybody an extra long weekend that we've been given. So have fun. But thank you, George. It was great.
My pleasure. Thank you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out as well. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Have a good long weekend, everyone.
Great.
Bye.